Tonight, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington, where he's preparing to address Congress, a move that's been criticized by the White House and congressional Democrats. How could this speech impact U.S.-Israeli relations? And the Department of Justice set to release a scathing report surrounding the Ferguson Police Department as early as this week, while outgoing U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder says more needs to be done to ease police-community relations on a local level before the feds step in. Plus, Mayor Bill de Blasio does it again. The mayor promising to boycott yet another St. Paddy's Day parade. De Blasio says the parade should be more inclusive, is backing off an appearance the right move for City Hall. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Those stories and much more in the next hour. Thank you very much for joining us. And tonight we're going to begin in Washington, where, despite criticism from President Obama, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to address Congress. It's a move that has Americans and Israelis alike concerned. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu acknowledged today that his visit to Washington has gotten a lot of hype.
Never has so much been written about a speech that hasn't been given.
That speech to Congress tomorrow proving to be a major test for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Netanyahu's expected to continue his strong criticisms of the long-term nuclear agreement with Iran that the Obama administration is negotiating. And he's coming before Congress at the invitation of Republican House Speaker John Boehner, who didn't involve the White House.
My speech is not intended to show any disrespect to President Obama or the esteemed office that he holds.
The Obama administration has called Boehner's invitation destructive to the U.S.-Israeli relations, but today, the president's spokesman took a dismissive tone.
It's the Prime Minister of Israel who's able to determine his own schedule and take the steps that he believes are necessary to communicate or to represent his country.
Prime Minister Netanyahu wants more sanctions on Iran and has been adamant that anything short of completely ending Iran's nuclear program is a threat to Israel's existence.
This same Iran vows to annihilate Israel. If it develops nuclear weapons, it would have the means to achieve that goal. We must not let that happen.
House Speaker John Boehner and Joe Lieberman, former senator from Connecticut, they took to the Sunday show speaking out in favor of Netanyahu's visit.
What I do wonder is why the White House feels threatened because the Congress wants to support Israel and wants to hear what a trusted ally has to say.
To some extent, the Democrats who are not going are actually making it partisan because by their absence. In other words, if Jan is right and John Boehner is trying to prove that Republicans are better friends of Israel, then the way to disprove that is for all the Democrats to go. In the end, most Democrats are going to be there. Tuesday, I predict Prime Minister Netanyahu will make a speech that is extremely respectful of President Obama.
Now, take a look at the numbers here. A new Gallup poll shows the majority of Americans view Netanyahu favorably. Got a 45% favorable opinion, and a little under a quarter have an unfavorable view of him. Now, I want to bring in our panel right now, and we're going to break this conversation in two parts, both the speech here and then also whether or not the U.S.'s negotiations with Iran is sound policy. Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College and also professor of campaign management at NYU. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. And Jeannie, I know you did a piece with HuffPo where you looked at where the public's pulse on this thing is. It's interesting. It's not just domestically what we think, but also even in Israel. There is an election coming up here, and that has a lot to do with what Netanyahu is doing this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's surprising is how similar opinion is both in Israel and America. You have 47 and 48% in Israel, 47 and in the United States, 48% saying that they think he should not be speaking before Congress. But that said, they also said, Americans, as you noted with the Gallup poll and other polls, have said they still support Netanyahu. And Israelis said it will have 63% said it will have zero impact on their vote in the upcoming March 17th election. So it's interesting to see that, you know, the real concern seems to be how he was invited and the fact that he accepted. There is still, though, interest in hearing what he has to say and absolutely no impact on his favorability ratings.
Dominic, I make you chief of staff. First, a congressperson, a congressperson in the New York delegation, especially in southern New York. And then also chief of staff of, let's say, somebody that's in upstate New York that doesn't have as big of a Jewish population in their districts. Would you tell your boss to go or to stay away?
When you say my boss, meaning
The congressperson.
okay, a congressperson.
Democratic congressman who's got
whether there's a large Jewish presence in the district or not, my advice would be that all members of Congress should go. So I would tell my representative that I strongly feel that that the United States should send a message of solidarity, even though we feel that this president has been disrespected. That Netanyahu in bed with the Republicans, they're doing an end around the White House. My advice would be strongly that go, be polite, be professional, and the public has a way of sensing what was the right thing to do based on the professor and the polling she just mentioned, and what was the wrong thing.
You agree?
To treat it, yeah, I think you have to go. Look, there's enough disagreement and people not listening to each other in Congress. Let's get together for one day, and who knows, maybe Republicans will take this as a lesson of what to do at State of the Union Day. But then I would treat it like State of the Union Day and have a press gathering or press availability afterwards and say, we listened to everything that Netanyahu had to say. We agree with President Obama that negotiating is the best way to try to bring peace to the Middle East and reduce the Iranian nuclear threat. We disagree with the tactics of this and that the president should have been involved in this, because after all, how would it look if President Obama campaigned went before the Knesset 3 weeks before either an Israeli election or a U.S. election here? And so you can foster the debate without being negative about the event itself.
Now, there's a second part to this conversation, not just, the form of how he was invited or invited himself here to really speak before the joint session and the White House's uninvolvement, however you want to say it, but also whether or not at the same time that he'll be speaking, we should be negotiating with Iran. And to that end, Secretary of State John Kerry is in Geneva for the latest round of Iranian nuclear talks as we speak. And today he said the administration would rather have no deal than a bad one.
Right now, no deal exists. No partial deal exists. And unless Iran is able to make the difficult decisions that will be required, there won't be a deal. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That is the standard by which this negotiation is taking place, and anyone who tells you otherwise is simply misinformed.
Okay, so Jeannie, here's the point. There's a couple different schools of thought on this. Sanctions have hurt Iran. Iranians will tell you that. Impartial international observers say that it's had an impact. But the question is, what John McCain, certainly Netanyahu and others is, don't talk to him, just keep doing the sanctions. To what end? At the end of the day, is that going to really do it? There are some hawks who even say, let's keep the military option on the table here. I don't know there's an appetite for that in America right now. But then there's finally the other folks, and I think the Secretary of State certainly falls in this column, which says, let's negotiate. Let's try and deal with this the way the real world is, not the way we'd like it to, and see if we can find some arrangement here where we further incentivize them not to have a nuclear program. I know politically how this is going to play at the CPACs of the world, but practically here, what's going to curry more favor with the American public? Does it hurt to talk to Iran or not?
I think it's such a difficult question because,
That's
you
why
know, you
I
can. Thank you. Because, you look and it really depends on the outcome. And so I don't think it hurts at all to negotiate, but I think there is, with good reason, fear that you can't trust the other side. And so there is a great deal of fear. I mean, quite frankly, I'm very sensitive to the Prime Minister and coming over here and making the case that he's making. I mean, if you put us in the position that Israel is in, and you imagine that, Canada is negotiating, something like this on our behalf. I mean, this is a scary proposition. So on both sides, I think you have to be very sensitive. I happen to say, you know what, the negotiations can't hurt. We just heard the Secretary of State saying there is no agreement yet, and when there's an agreement, we're going to make sure that Israel is protected. But, I think also people who are pessimistic about this prospect have good reason if you look back historically. So there's no easy answers here, but the president and you've got to say Secretary Kerry have put themselves on the line for this deal at this point.
My only point is for the critics to say that you can't talk to him, Dom, What do you think is going to happen? That they're all of a sudden not going to continue to try and develop one if we don't talk to them, and if we do, then all of a sudden, oh, now they're going to have their secret stash of plutonium here, and that's where they're going to go. I just think where they accuse this White House of naivete on this, or who they're dealing with, they're also being naive to think that just if you say you can't do it and you're going to do sanctions, that makes the problem go away. It's like the same kind of conversation on a different level about what to do with Cuba, right?
You say the word, you said, quote, naive.
Yeah.
I substitute the word political when you say naive, when you're talking about the critics. Perhaps there are some that make valid arguments as it relates to negotiation, but I think most people would agree with what the professor just articulated, and that is what most reasonable people, my belief, would say, negotiate. Now, you know, this president, he's been criticized in the past for negotiating. And or I would say more often positive than not, it turned out with a good result without any American lives being harmed. So we're talking about nuclear arms. What's wrong with negotiating? The Secretary of State has said if it's not a good deal, there won't be any deal. What's wrong with that?
And can I just say that, playing devil's advocate for a minute, because I happen to agree that they should be negotiating, but playing devil's advocate, the fear of people is that, putting the politics aside, is that you're giving them time to continue to develop a nuclear weapon while these talks are going. I mean, that's the fear.
Now,
I agree.
And I've heard
There's
that.
no
I've heard
basis
what
in
Jeannie just
reality,
says.
but that's...
More time. They're 1 year from developing a nuke here for the last 20 years, Andrew, and the time doesn't stop if you don't talk to them. This time's still going on.
If anybody thinks that we're not going to know when they have nuclear capabilities, we're going to know. And if anybody thinks that Israel's not going to know when Iran has nuclear capabilities, they're going to know. So I think there are ways around this. Look, Iran has made a terrific boogeyman, and they've done this themselves to a certain degree by some of their actions. But we're 35 years, and only 35 years removed from Iran when it was the most westernized Arab country in the Middle East. And I keep thinking back to the mid-'80s when the Soviet Union was the evil empire, and Reagan struck a deal on nuclear arms reduction and monitoring, trust but verify. And I think we can do the same thing with other enemies today. And by the way, that's talking and dealing with our adversaries is how we bring them into the fold of westernized nations, and we make friends. They're only a few years removed from the Green Revolution, or the attempted Green Revolution in Tahrir Square, and you saw the pro-democracy movement flourish in Iran. Let's not push them further away if we don't have to.
We want you to sound off. Everybody head over to Facebook and Twitter and answer a question. Do you want your lawmaker to attend Netanyahu's speech to Congress here? Just think about it in your terms, your representative. Do you want them sitting in the crowd? Now, coming up next, we're going to come closer to home. Mayor Bill de Blasio digging in his heels, threatening to boycott yet another St. Patrick's Day parade. Mayor says the parade needs to be more inclusive if anyone expects him to ever show up. Is that the right move? We'll be back to talk about that and much more. Stay with us.